Test, test.
Good morning. Good morning. Actually, great morning. We're so happy you're here. We're the guests of the good folks here at the Bell Museum, the Bell family, and the Baddeck community, and our sponsors, and we thank them for that. And as we were saying last night, we also consider you our guests. This is our wonderful opportunity to introduce you to our world of kites and kiting and that whole period of kites to flight. So today we're going to have two presentations. The first one is going to be from Thom Shaken, and his is entitled, "And in the Beginning, Chronology of North American Kites up to the Wright Brothers and the Bells." Before I begin further, washrooms are outside to the right and to the right. The presentation is going to be, what, about 40 minutes or so?
Probably.
About 40 minutes or so, and then we'll take some questions, and then we'll have a break for about a half an hour, and then we'll have our next presentation. Aside from that, a quick, heartfelt, and wonderful thank you to the folks who sponsored this and helped make this possible, which is Enterprise Cape Breton Corporation, the Province of Nova Scotia, Destination Cape Breton Association, the Municipality of the County of Victoria, we love that.
Yes.
Parks Canada, of course, the Baddeck Area Business and Tourist Association. So, actually, let's just give them an applause. With that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Thom Shaken. Thom began building and flying kites. It's been a part of his life for as long as he can remember, and he keeps finding new and interesting ways to enjoy them. After being introduced to the traditional single-line kites of India in the early 1970s, Thom spent the next several years learning all he could about them. This led him to dual and quad-line kites, and finally to large show kites. Along the way, Thom also developed an interest in the art and history of kite culture around the world. And he began to share what he was learning through presentations and workshops at events and festivals in Canada and the United States, and such as today. Thom's research and designs and builds kites, and he helps organize and promote a wide variety of kiting events and activities for different groups and organizations. He says the best thing about kiting is the people you meet along the way, and he said that again this morning about Baddeck, and sharing the joys and artistry of those beautiful creations. Currently working with the Draken Foundation of Seattle, Washington, Thom is collecting and documenting information on the world's oldest known kite, an 18th century pear kite discovered 25 years ago in the Netherlands. Thom's advice and his signature and all his emails, the rest of it, is keep looking up. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Thom Shaken.
Good morning and welcome. I don't think I need, does my voice project well enough for everyone here? That's good. I may need to step out of character a bit and put on some reading glasses here. I assembled this talk. Normally I like to be very much in front of everyone active in what I'm doing. This is very much a canned presentation, and I'm afraid I have to read it. So I might, is that okay? Does anybody want the photo opportunity of authentic 18th century before I cheat? Okay. All right, let me get going here. Thank goodness. Yes, we had lots of technical problems. Again, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the help of the staff here We had all sorts of technical difficulties making sure things worked, and it looks like we're rolling. Thank you all for coming. As I said, or as George said, my name is Thom Shaken, and as you can see, the topic I was asked to present here is entitled, "And in the Beginning, a Chronology of North American Kites up to the Wrights and Bell." Now, under the best of circumstances, if I was to speak on that chronology, that very, very narrow subject, this would be a very short talk. It would also lack the context, or lack any context really, because kites in North America didn't develop in a vacuum. On the other hand, if I was to expand the subject, the question is where to stop. With that in mind, I've chosen something of a middle path, sort of kite history's greatest hits, if you will. I'm going to emphasize both the historic milestones of worldwide kite development, as well as their relationship to manned flight. Before we get rolling here, you may be wondering why I'm dressed the way I am. And the short answer is that George asked me to do it. The longer answer is that I'm the Board of Trustees Education Chair of the Friends of Fort Ontario State Historic Site in Oswego, New York. Most people tend to look at history the way it was taught to them. A chronology of prominent people, places, dates, and events. Unfortunately, this tends to make the whole affair pretty dull. And so like many similar facilities, the Bell Museum included, we at Fort Ontario strive to create a dynamic living history theater for the purpose of bringing the past to life. Part of our efforts depict military operations from the time of the original fort's construction in 1755. Whoa. You can tell I'm totally unfamiliar with what I'm doing here. And as colorful and exciting as these displays can be, they only tell a very small aspect of their times. For this reason, we also strive to bring our visitors a view of everyday lives and activities of the civilian population and encourage them to participate in these activities as well. Of course, seeing as I'm the education chair, a number of these public activities involve kites. And some of the most popular are the historic kite building workshops, where we invite our visitors to build their own kite using period-correct tools and materials. In fact, as a side note, I believe this weekend's activities right here include kite building workshops as well. One of the interesting things I discovered at our events is how surprisingly easy it is to move about unchallenged when you're not the only person in period costume. Easy as that is, until I happen to pick up a kite. As soon as I do this, I become a magnet for public attention, and they begin to point and tell me they know exactly who I'm supposed to be. Anybody have an idea of that? Ben Franklin, of course. Arguably the most famous kite flyer. And I say arguably because here at the Bell Museum, that contention may very well be disputed. Regardless, Franklin's electric kite experiment in June of 1752 is one of those prominent events that has remained in the public consciousness. Additionally, it was also the first recorded kite flight in North America. And so, we find ourselves right where the title of this talk said we should be. But before we get too comfortable in the 18th century, I'd like to take a jump back in time to the known origins of kites. We'll return to Mr. Franklin at a more chronological time. When it comes to a historical kite perspective, I'm very much a product, or any historical perspective for that matter, I'm very much a product of the 20th century, living in the 21st century with an understanding and appreciation of the 18th century. When it comes to historical kite research, I center my focus on 18th century kites from the Western Hemisphere. Needless to say, it's not a very crowded field. In fact, you might say, I'm outstanding in my field. One of the difficulties with stepping out beyond a period of time and place where you're comfortable and knowledgeable about the culture and the worldview is that you must now rely on other people's interpretations to extract meaning from circumstances and events. As any historical researcher will tell you, one always strives to locate the primary source of any information and then proceed to evaluate it in the context of its time and circumstances. Unfortunately, in traveling back to the stories and myths surrounding the origins of kites, we often find ourselves adrift and conflicted with very few sources of reliable, concrete information on which to draw conclusions. Am I doing okay speaking to you? I should ask, because I'm reading. I admit it. That said, the first recorded written record that of what may be a kite occurs roughly in the year 450 BC in China. The philosopher Mo Tzu, who is also sometimes referred to as Modi, Moti, or Mozi, is said to have spent 3 years building a wooden bird that was damaged only after a single day of flying. In China, this is regarded as the earliest documented reference to a kite. But to be honest, not everyone, myself included, accepts this. Around 400 BC, a time considered to be the height of classical Greek civilization, the philosopher Archytas of Tarentum is said to have constructed what he called the pigeon, a bird-shaped model which is sometimes reputed to be either the first self-propelled flying device or a kite. Once again, the evidence is a bit more than underwhelming. This image on a 14th century BC Greek vase was first suggested to be a kite in 1867, but discovered to actually be a spinning bobbin by the English aviation historian Charles Gibbs Smith. There is no known evidence showing kites in Europe before the 14th century AD. The earliest unambiguous written record of what is clearly stated to be a kite occurs around 200 BC in China. General Han Xin is said to have used a kite to measure the distance between his army and the walls of a palace so that a tunnel could be dug to allow his troops to enter. From this time forward, there are numerous and varied references to kites from Chinese sources. In military applications, the Chinese employed kites in a variety of ingenious ways, sending communications, using noise-making devices, flown over an opposing army at night as psychological warfare, and in dropping both propaganda leaflets and fire bombs. The first man-lifting kites were also for military purposes, gathering intelligence from aerial observation and as an airborne archery platform. Spiritually, kites became a means to commune with the gods and became to be used as a form of divination. And publicly, kites began to be flown in celebration of holidays and as a popular recreational pastime. While the oldest written reference to a kite may always belong to the lettered civilization of China, sociologists and cultural anthropologists have noted that the known origin and purpose of Chinese kites does not address any basic survival interests. In contrast, the long use of kites in the island cultures of Indonesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia shows a clear food gathering purpose. Made from simple, readily obtainable local materials such as leaves, reeds, and grasses, kites were used for fishing and holding aloft nets intended to snare bats for food. The history of kites goes back in the oral tradition of these islands to the time of the gods, who were themselves kite flyers. These far-flung island cultures were well-versed in the arts of both sailing and fishing, and used their knowledge to produce a beautiful and practical collection of kite styles to serve their varied purposes, which included spiritual divination and recreational kite flying as well. Since archaeological evidence shows that the Indonesian archipelago was inhabited at least 1.5 million years ago, with DNA evidence suggesting that the ancestors of the current population arrived around 2000 BC, it is certainly well worth asking just how ancient this kite culture might be. One possible answer may be found in the form of a cave painting discovered on Muna Island, located in southeast Sulawesi province of Indonesia. First brought to the world's attention in 1999 when it was shown to the French kite historian Philippe Coutenceau and German photographer Hans Silvestre. The ochre image appears to show a human figure flying a lozenge-shaped kite, similar in appearance to the woven leaf kites, still flown in the Sulawesi region to this day. Coutenceau expressed concern about the age of the image due to the fact that it had been discovered just after his previous visit to the area in 1997. He also noted that its execution was done in a different style and was darker than the other adjacent paintings. In 2002, the site was visited by Wolfgang Beach, who sent high-resolution photographs to rock art authority Robert Bednarik. Bednarik stated that the probability of dating the image convincingly was very low. but in a second correspondence said that I think you can safely assume that your cave art is genuine, that it is not a modern fraudulent attempt to create such art. Finally, concerning the interpretation, I cannot say anything. As a scientist, I have no interest in interpretation except by those of the indigenous people who would know the correct meaning of rock art. Interpretation by cultural outsiders such as you or I only reflects our thought patterns and methods of visual perception. It is of no use in a scientific study. Mr. Bednarik's statements about interpretation by cultural outsiders is a fitting introduction to the notion of ancient Egyptian kites. The ancient Egyptians are the earliest known culture to harness the power of the wind as sails, over 5,000 years ago. Considering this, the idea that they might also have developed kites would not be particularly surprising. Even so, to make such an assertion requires proof in the form of some sort of evidence. In 2001, a California woman enlisted the help of Caltech University to successfully raise an obelisk using a kite, a pulley system, a supporting frame, even though there is no evidence that the ancient Egyptians had either kites or the type of compound pulley system employed. The kite used for this effort was a parafoil, a frameless ram airfoil design made of modern materials conceived by Canadian native Damina Jalbert in 1957 and patented in 1966. In addition to the media reports at the time, the story was made into a documentary by the History Channel in 2004 and a self-published book in 2011. So now the question is, where's the evidence? Unfortunately, as it turns out, there isn't any. None whatsoever. The recent book, co-written by this theory's author, Maureen Clemens, should provide the best primary source of information possible. Yet surprisingly, Clemens claims that the evidence that is visual and has been hiding right in front of us all along is not backed up by a single citation. In fact, the image here is the only example of what Clemens says she is talking about. An interpretation by a cultural outsider, it suggests that the shape of the Ankh, the ancient Egyptian symbol of life, is actually a tool intended to be used in manipulating kite flying line. Ironically, this creatively bizarre pareidolia is a fitting commentary on her total lack of evidence, in the fact that her Ankh line handling tool does not have any way to secure itself to an anchor, effectively rendering itself useless. Oddly enough, I would not even be mentioning Clemens' contentions that kites could have been used to build the pyramids, were it not for her remarkably successful self-promotion efforts in the scientific media and her ability to secure financial aid from some very surprising sources, including the National Geographic Society. As we leave the ancient world and begin to enter the so-called Common Era, we start to see a diffusion of kites out of China, most likely brought about by the missionary travels of Buddhist monks. Two of these routes can be traced to the 7th century AD, the first to Korea and later to Japan. We know very little about the life of Marco Polo. Beyond the stories of his travels in China in the late 13th century, all we have is his will. One of the many points made by the skeptics of his stories is that he failed to mention kites. And despite this criticism, Polo continued to remain silent on the subject of Chinese kites until 1932, when the discovery of a manuscript in the library of the Cathedral of Toledo, the so-called Z manuscript, provided a narrative 50% longer than any previously known version. In it, Polo describes a process of divination whereby the hatch grating of a ship is fitted with 8 cords and flown as a man-lifting kite. The outcome of the hatch kite's flight would determine not only the fate of the poor drunkard who had the misfortune of being bound to it, but also that of the ship's prospects for that sailing season. While it is clear from Polo's explanation that he had never seen a kite before, let alone one used to lift a man, his account of this construction and manipulation of this hatch grating turned kite is very convincing. Polo's account is the first known example of a Western observer describing a kite. This is the earliest known illustration of a European kite, found in Walter de Millimet's early 14th century treatise on kingship, De Nobilitatibus. You can tell I was not a Latin scholar. In the interest of clarity, This is the image the miniaturist intended, with the wedding transfer removed. Here, a kite large enough to require the efforts of 3 men and a winch is seen carrying or dropping something usually described as a fireball over a fortified city. The provenance of the kite itself is ambiguous. On the one hand, this type of plain surface kite, that's a fancy way of saying a kite that needs a flat kite that needs a long tail, is an Eastern style, identified with Southeast Asia. On the other hand, it is equally possible that this particular style of kite evolved independently in the West as a pennon-shaped kite. Here on the left, we see an early 15th century illumination depicting a rider holding aloft a Draco from Conrad Kleisler's often copied manuscript Bellefortis. We know this particular Draco is in fact a plain surface pennon kite by the front view shown on the right side of the folio. Kind of a blurry image here, right there. The description written by an unknown author of that fearsome fellow right there on the right in the Vienna Codex 3064 fireworks book clearly demonstrates a first-hand knowledge of kite construction and manipulation. This particular pennon kite, we are told, is constructed from parchment for the head, silk or other lightweight cloth for the tail, and is framed with fir sticks. As I just mentioned, it's unknown whether these pennon kites were an independent Western development arising from the use of windsocks as military standards, such as the Draco, or the adoption of an Eastern-style kite form. Although Giambattista della Porta's description of an early Eastern-style rectangular kite was somewhat vague, the fact that his book was widely read meant it served as the basis for most of what was written about kites in the West for the next 100 or more years. Reaching well beyond the 16th century to this day, the name Della Porta is still used to describe a plain surface rectangular kite with tails. This engraving in Jacob Catt's 1618 emblem book is the first known European illustration of a lozenge-shaped kite, as well as the first depiction of a kite used in the West as a child's plaything. The appearance of the lozenge, and you can see it right up there, the kite. And of course the child is running, and as kite flyers we always tell people, if you need to run with a kite, it's not windy enough. Here are our oldest European example, we see the child running, so I think it was passed on through history. But the appearance of the lozenge, as well as the pear and arch form kites, were undoubtedly the result of Asian trade routes established by the English, the Portuguese, and especially the Dutch. Interesting, Peter Bruegel's, the Elders, famous picture of children at play, painted only 58 years earlier, doesn't show a kite in it at all. And as a side note, the location depicted here is the courtyard of the former abbey of Our Lady of Middelburg in the Netherlands. And it still stands today, looking much as it did in this illustration here. Oh, I don't want to miss that one. John Bates' 1634 first edition of The Mysteries of Nature and Art is the earliest image of a kite in an English language book. And I'm very privileged today, thanks to Paul Chapman, who will be presenting for you later on Samuel Cody, to actually have this book here with us. 1635, and you can see right here that image. And I hope, is everybody able to see this?
White gloves. White gloves.
I know, white gloves, right? Yes, but this is that actual, in fact, if I can, I'll try to act like I know what I'm doing here and not shaking horribly, but I'm delighted to show. Where is our title? There we go, right there. You can see just the same as the image. And for me, you can tell I'm shaking. I love this. This is the greatest thing of researching kites is when one of your fellow kite history researchers brings something like this. I don't even want it falling off.
This answer is probably not more than about 20 copies known of this book in the world. And it was a book that inspired Isaac Newton. So it's got a lot of history.
And I also apologize for reading. It's amazing. George put this together on incredibly short notice. and then challenged me to actually present you a chronology. Can you tell I've never done a chronology? And I'm used to having it memorized and being out there in front of you, and I really apologize. I don't know how good a reader I am. But it's abhorrent to me to read a canned presentation when I should be just dancing around my slides. I assure you that my fellow presenters are going to do a much finer job. 1 year later, after John Bates' book, in 1635, Babington's Pyrotechnica becomes the first printed use of the word kite. It was used without explanation, suggesting that the object in its name was already familiar in England by 1635. Although kite historian Clive Hart states that during the 16th and 17th century, plain surface kites, both of the dragon-shaped type and the better-known pear and diamond shapes, became increasingly common. The Babington pear kite illustration right here is the first pear illustration I'm personally aware of. I don't know, Mike Feltus, do you know of? So that, just in case you're wondering, because we are talking about pear kites, that is the shape right there.
He's right.
Hmm?
And he's right.
Yes, and he's running too, yes. Very absurd. Athanasius Kircher was a German Jesuit scholar who published 40 major works on a wide range of subjects. A number of Kircher's works present fanciful illustrations of windsock-type kites, but it is unknown whether these designs were merely hypothetical or actually constructed. In 1646, Kircher mentions the use of man-lifting kites in China, based on information provided to him from fellow Jesuits living there. In addition to Ben Franklin and Alexander Graham Bell, another candidate for the title of most famous kite flyer would have to be this fellow, Sir Isaac Newton. According to William Stukeley's memoir, Newton was particularly ingenious at inventing diversions, as for instance, in making paper kites, which he first introduced here, which I don't really believe he introduced, but according to Stukeley, what can I say? He took pains, they say, to find out their proportions and figure out the whereabouts of where the strings should be fastened to greatest advantage, and in how many places. Likewise, he first made lanterns of paper, crimpled, which he used to go to school by in winter mornings with a candle, and tied them to the tails of the kite at dark nights, which at first affrighted the country people exceedingly, thinking they were comets. The August 16, 1746 edition of the Westminster Journal in London, England, devoted its entire front page to the subject of kites, and specifically relates the successful efforts of one Mr. Condell to create a realistic bird kite for hunting. The author states that Mr. Condell is entitled to the honor of first imitating the figure and motion of a living kite, and goes on to say that several gentlemen of learning and wealth are endeavoring to improve upon Mr. Condell's improvements, and may possibly hereafter claim the glory of more than belongs to them. We are told that Mr. Condell threw off the long knotted tail of the plain kite and substituted one abundantly more natural in figure and use. Sadly, the author does not say anything about how Mr. Condell achieved this. But he does identify the historic cricket venue of White Conduit Fields in Islington as Mr. Condell's kite flying field, or Mr. Condell's kite flying field. Was I saying conduit? Unfortunately, Mr. Condell's been lost to history. I've been unable to find him, and so it's all the more appropriate that I get his name right. In 1749, the first recorded weather experiments with kites took place in Scotland. Professor Alexander Wilson of the University of Glasgow and his student Thomas Melville attempted to discover if the air at lower altitudes was warmer or colder than the air at higher altitudes. Wilson and Melville took 6 kites and tied a small thermometer to each. This was the first recorded attempt to obtain scientific data using kites, as well as the first recorded use of kites in a train. And so, we find ourselves, as promised, back in 1752, in the middle of 18th century North America with good old Ben. This is as good a time as any to mention the fact that the use of what has come to be known as the electric kite was something that was practiced worldwide. Both Franklin in America and his contemporary Jacques de Roma in France invented the famous kite experiment independently, and there were many later noteworthy practitioners to follow, such as the Italian Tiberius Cavallo, working in England. While there are some who claim that Franklin never flew his kite in 1752, that's a subject for another occasion. And even if it were true, Franklin would still earn the title of North America's first recorded kite flyer. In a letter to his French correspondent, Jacques Barbeau-Dubois, thankfully I don't have to speak French either, in 1773, Franklin wrote of his boyhood experience using a big kite to pull himself across a pond. And so it comes to pass that Franklin not only earns the title of first recorded kite flyer in North America, but the title of first recorded traction kite flyer as well. As another side note, the illustration shown here, produced for a traveling exhibition celebrating the Franklin tercentenary in 2006, mistranslates what Franklin wrote and changes his big kite to a paper kite. One can only imagine what future generations of Franklin naysayers will have to say about that. Oh, okay, and I can step away here and show you that this is in fact, and later today, if you folks are around, this is a model of the kite that Franklin described, which is nothing more than a large silk handkerchief. And actually, thanks to the good people here at the museum, we're able to procure historically accurate wood. The strips he refers to are cedar. This is white cedar, might have been red cedar. Either is available in North America. And for the purpose of shooting down the naysayers, later on, winds willing, we'll show you that this kite not only flies, but flies quite well, very stably, and is, believe me, could actually lift my frock coat if the winds were willing. And any of you who would like to try this on later, you're certainly welcome to do that. It's a cumbersome piece of attire there. And I am doing well on time, I think. Another great concern. George Cayley was one of the most important people in the history of aeronautics. Many consider him the first true scientific aerial investigator and the first person to understand the underlying principles and forces of flight. In 1799, he set forth the concept of the modern airplane as a fixed-wing flying machine. As you can see on this side, Cayley's early glider model of 1804 has a plan form very much like that of modern aircraft and uses the shape of the popular arch pattern down there at the bottom for its wing. Cayley also designed the first known successful glider to carry a human being aloft. That's not including the man-lifting kites of China and some other pretty scary things. And of course, a glider is not tethered, so we'll give Cayley that distinction. The 19th century became the golden age for kites in the Western Hemisphere. During Captain Sir William Edward Parry and Reverend George Fisher's second voyage of discovering a Northwest Passage, of a Northwest Passage, searching for it, from the Atlantic to the Pacific in 1821 to 1823, they took weather readings from a kite off an island in the northeast coast of North America, off the northeast coast of North America. In 1827, English schoolteacher George Pocock publishes the Aeropluristic Art, or Navigation in the Air by the Use of Kites or Buoyant Sails. In it, he presents a char-volant, maneuverable kite carriage, as well as suggesting the use of kites as a means of rescue and auxiliary sail power for ships. In 1845, Sir John Franklin's ill-fated Arctic expedition carried Delaporta kites to aid in pulling sledges. The American meteorologist James Pollard Espy, known as the Storm King, began using kite-borne meteorological instruments around 1827, and later formed the Franklin Kite Club in Philadelphia to promote the use of kites for science. In 1848, 16-year-old Holman Walsh wins a kite flying contest by flying his kite across the Niagara River Gorge. His kite string was then used to bring across successfully heavier lines, culminating in the steel cables that were used to build the suspension bridge between the United States and Canada. In Virginia, Mahlon Loomis claimed to have sent a wireless telegraph signal between two kites in 1866. The Blue Hill Meteorological Observatory, founded by Abbot Lawrence Roch in 1884, is the longest continually operating meteorological observation site in the United States. In the 1890s, it was also the location of the earliest kite soundings of the atmosphere in North America. William Abner Eddy, an American journalist famous for his tailless diamond-shaped kite based on the Indonesian Malay design, was also an innovator with photographic and meteorological experimentation with kites. In 1894, Eddy's kites became the standard lifting device for the meteorological instruments of the Blue Hill Observatory. On May 30th, 1895, Eddy took the first aerial photograph in North America, 7 years after French aerial photographer Arthur Batut's first kite-based photographs in France. Born in Greenwich, England, Lawrence Hargrave immigrated with his family to Australia in 1865. In his career, Hargrave invented many devices, but never applied for a patent for any of them. Even though he needed the money, he was passionate believer in the scientific communication as a key to furthering progress. Hargrave's creation of the box kite in 1892 greatly improved the lift-to-drag ratio of early gliders. Oh, I'll do it again. Hargrave was successfully lifted off the ground under a train of 4 of his box kites in 1894. And in 1895, the Blue Hill Observatory switched from Eddy's diamond kites to Hargrave's box kites for reliable instrument lifting. Hargrave's work also inspired Alexander Graham Bell to begin his own experiments, which eventually led to Bell's tetrahedral kite designs. In 1901, Guglielmo Marconi raises the first kite-borne aerial to capture, raises a kite-borne aerial to capture the first transatlantic wireless signal on Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland. And here, last but not least, we see the Wright Brothers 1901 glider being flown as a kite. I won't go into detail what is going on here because one of my esteemed colleagues, Tom Crouch, who insists, although I call him the director of the National Air and Space Museum, insists he's only the senior curator. There are a number of things that I didn't mention in my talk here, but that was because my other esteemed colleagues will be speaking on them. But that pretty much gives you a rough chronology of our time leading up to the wonderful innovations of both Bell and the Wrights, and Samuel Franklin Cody, who I did not address, that Paul will be speaking of later in our program. And I actually pulled it off at 10:30. Oh yes, any questions, please?
How did they get the readings from the thermometers up there?
Well, now that's a very good question, and again, with time, I'm glad you brought that up. They actually tied the thermometers with small pieces of cloth, and they released it. It was a time release mechanism that returned the thermometers back and were read, which at the time was rather innovative when you think about it. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add something. At that time, the thermometer scales were not well known, and they were developing the thermometer scales. But there would be a maximum and minimum thermometers.
Right.
And they were research. It was a technical program at the University of Glasgow, where they were developing thermometers. And I think the plants were a bit sidelined, but
Right.
the temperature drops to 2 degrees per 1,000 feet. And I think they were trying to measure the difference in the temperature of the atmosphere.
So with the store, the reading, that's about like back down to the ground.
Exactly. Yeah.
While you were speaking, I was thinking of the ancient Greek myth of Daedalus and Icarus, and I wondered if that had any connection. I mean, did the Greeks possibly have
present here, which you might have told by the way I did, is the whole idea of ancient Egyptian kites. And not to change the subject, but it does seem, I mean, they are the oldest civilization we know of that employed sail power. Why didn't they make that jump? Okay, but as scientists or researchers, we really need to concentrate on the facts. There are certain things that I creatively, I mean, I did mention the Greek stories, because when people come to me, that's what I hear. I hear China, I hear the Pacific, the Southern Pacific, and lately the last 5 or 6 years because of this, I actually discovered in research, I couldn't figure out back in 2001 what was going on. Well, I mean, I looked into the Egyptian thing. I couldn't understand why then all of a sudden people